There is no present or future, only the past, happening over and over again, now. And the 7 years of plenteousness that was in the land of Egypt were ended, and the 7 years of dearth began to come, according as Joseph had said. And the dearth was in all lands. But in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph, what he saith to you, do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses, and sold unto the Egyptians. And the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in all lands.
Here it tells of the story of Joseph, who was taken captive to Egypt, and ended up second to Pharaoh after God, through Joseph, interpreted a troubling dream that Pharaoh had had. This dream was showing of a coming famine, and this famine was not just localized to Egypt, but in verse 56 it says that it covered the face of the whole earth. It was worldwide. We read in the beginning of Genesis 41 about Pharaoh's dream, where he dreamt about 7 well-fed cows coming up out of the river, and then 7 thin cows that came up after them and ate the 7 well-fed cows. And then he dreams a second time about 7 fat ears of corn and 7 thin ears, and the thin once again eat the fat. And this dream troubled Pharaoh. Eventually, Joseph is called to interpret Pharaoh's dream, and Joseph tells Pharaoh that it is the God of heaven that would give him the interpretation. And God revealed through Joseph that there will be 7 years of plenty in Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine, and apparently the famine would be very severe.
And there shall arise after them 7 years of famine, and all the plenty shall be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine shall consume the land.
Joseph told Pharaoh that the famine would be so great that the years of plenty would soon be forgotten. Pharaoh was convinced that Joseph had correctly interpreted his dream and decided to appoint Joseph as vizier to oversee the gathering of the grain during the 7 years of plenty. A vizier was the highest official in ancient Egypt, next only to Pharaoh himself. These were extraordinary powers to give to anyone, especially a foreigner who had been a slave and imprisoned. It is very much like the story that we have in Daniel, where King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and worshipped Daniel after God had revealed to Daniel the king's dream. Now, here in Egypt, Pharaoh tells Joseph,
Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou.
Now, many like to think of the Bible as a book of fanciful stories, but over the years through history and archaeology, the chronicles of the Bible have been confirmed and have shown the Bible to be accurate and true. So let's dig up the past to see what the archaeologists have found regarding this time of Joseph. Pharaoh provided Joseph with a new name as part of his assimilation into the culture and society of Egypt. And just like Daniel, whose name was changed to Belteshazzar, Joseph's name was also changed to Zapna Paneah. Multiple translations have been proposed, but a popular view is the following.
The God speaks and he lives. According to the Baker Encyclopedia of the Bible, Zaphnath Paneah is most likely a Semitic form of an original Egyptian name, meaning, says the God, he will live.
In the cases of Daniel and Joseph, these biblical heroes show that a king can change your name, but he can't change your character.
And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand, and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, Bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt.
Tremendous power was given to Joseph, who was bought as a foreigner and slave to Egypt, just like Daniel had also been bought as a foreigner and slave to Babylon. Both of these young men of God were given tremendous powers, and you will find many parallels between Joseph and Daniel. And so Joseph was appointed as the vizier of Egypt. Now the question has been asked, who was this Pharaoh ruling at the time of Joseph? And although there is some debate, many believe that the story of Joseph took place at the beginning of the 12th dynasty of Egypt, and that the Pharaoh concerned would be the Pharaoh called Sesostris I.
While Joseph was in Egypt, two different Nile famine inscriptions likely referred to the same event in the year 1895 BC, in regnal year 25 of Sesostris I. The kindness and concern for the poor typifies the goodness of the Egyptians when Joseph entered Egypt, and suggests the greatest food relief program in world history. Importance of the two Nile famine inscriptions. The inscription dates to 1877 BC, which is year 3 of the famine of Joseph's dream, of the 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. Jacob entered Egypt in 1876 BC, the year after Amenemhet died. The famine in the tablet likely dates to year 25 of Sesostris I, which is year 4 of Joseph in Egypt in 1895 BC.
Archaeology shows that what you read in the book, you find in the ground. In the time of Sesostris I, we read of Mentuhotep, who had great power at this time. James Breasted, in his History of Egypt, wrote,
When he also held the office of chief treasurer, as did the powerful vizier Mentuhotep under Sesostris I, the account which he could give of himself on his tombstone read like the declaration of the king's powers.
As for Joseph himself, there was a vizier under Sesostris I who had extraordinary powers. His name was Mentuhotep. Of him was also wrote,
In a work, our Mentuhotep, who was invested with several priestly dignities, and who was Pharaoh's treasurer, appears as the alter ego of the king. When he arrived, the great personage bowed down before him at the outer door of the royal palace.
The Bible continues to give us more details.
And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, Bow the knee! And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt.
Pharaoh had Joseph ride in the second chariot which he had, and the people cried out before him and bowed the knee. This was a sort of status that was not usually ascribed to viziers, but it was in the case of Mentuhotep. Another interesting fact is that we find a canal in Egypt from the 12th dynasty called Joseph's Canal.
Joseph's Canal, or Bar Yusuf, is a canal system in Egypt that parallels the Nile River, and brings water to the Fayum oasis south of Cairo. The modern system now supports vast farmlands and the largest oasis in Egypt, with a population of 2 million people. However, the modern canal is largely a reconstruction of an ancient system that was originally built during Egypt's 12th dynasty. As the legendary name implies, the canal is believed to have been an engineering project that was under the oversight of Joseph, son of Jacob, following the infamous famine in Egypt.
There is something else that is very significant in this area. It's just further downstream, in a place called Beni Hassan.
One archaeological discovery that is of great interest to biblical scholars is the painting found in a tomb in the village of Beni Hassan. The painting shows a caravan of people from Syro-Palestine visiting the governor. According to some archaeologists, the painting offers important insights into the world of the biblical patriarchs.
There are many other discoveries that you can look into on this subject, but here we have just skimmed the surface as a backdrop to our study. We will now just take another look at our opening verses as we look at the time of Joseph and compare it to the end times that we are living in today.
And the 7 years of plenteousness that was in the land of Egypt were ended, and the 7 years of dearth began to come, according as Joseph had said. And the dearth was in all lands. But in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph, what he saith to you, do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses, and sold unto the Egyptians. And the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in all lands.
The Bible tells us that the famine was in all countries, all lands. There was nowhere on the face of the earth that this famine was not stretching. And as we tie our parallels with end-time events and the time of trouble spoken of by Daniel, the Bible tells us that no one at the end of Earth's history will escape. This time of trouble will affect the whole earth.
And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be.
Now, let's look at a few parallels in the book of Revelation and compare them to the story of the famine in Genesis. We will see that the Egyptians had sold everything they had. They had sold their possessions, their land. They had even sold their sons and daughters and themselves to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh ends up in control of everything and everyone.
And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world wondered after the beast.
Now, in many of our other videos, we, like the Protestants and forefathers of old, have understood and shown that this power points to the papacy. This power suffered a deadly wound back in 1798. but has slowly been recovering since that time. And when the wound is fully healed, and church and state come together, then all those who are not following God will end up worshipping this power and be lost.
And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world.
So, through a course of tragedies, disaster, crisis, coercion, force, and bribery, whatever it may be, the Bible says that eventually all of the world will be brought to a place where they are required to worship this beast. Now, in the Bible, worship usually means reverence offered to a divine being or supernatural power, but it can also signify serving somebody who commands our allegiance, as we see in the example of Jesus, who was tempted in the wilderness. Satan demanded that Jesus fall down and worship him in return for power and wealth. But Jesus turns to Satan and quotes from Deuteronomy.
Then saith Jesus unto him, Get thee hence, Satan, for it is written, Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve.
Jesus tells us that we should only worship the one true God in heaven, and him only should we serve. So to serve or obey can be the same biblically as worshipping. We can see the parallels with the Egyptians who end up serving the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh. The Bible tells us that at the end of time, the world ends up serving the modern-day Pharaoh, who also requires worship. And this is the papal power, of which we have many videos explaining this. The Bible has much to say on this subject, and shows that without a doubt, this system requires worship and total control. This is the Antichrist, the beast power of Revelation 13. In Revelation, we have the description of the mark of the beast, and it becomes even more explicit about these measures that will be used to bring the world to worship and serve this power, where eventually a mark will be enforced on people throughout the world who choose to go along with their dictates.
And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name.
This mark, which will be given in the right hand or the forehead, is not a literal mark, stamp, or tattoo as many proclaim. It will be far more subtle than that, and this mark will be received by those who go along with the dictates of the beast's power. The Bible tells us clearly that this will be the majority of Earth's population. You can see more about this in our video, The Mark of the Beast.
And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world.
So those who will not go along with this power are those who do not have their names written in the book of life. Maybe for ease of life now, or for fear of the penalty to be inflicted upon those who will not follow and worship this power and the government he creates. These are those who will ultimately be destroyed with the Antichrist when Christ returns for his people. In the end, it comes down to our individual choice and who we will serve. Will we decide on what may look like fleeting rewards now, or will we look past them to the eternal reward of life everlasting? At the end, it will all be about worship and who we will serve. Those who refuse to follow these earthly powers, who are ultimately following the will of Satan, will be forbidden to buy or sell, and eventually every earthly support will be cut off from those who remain loyal to God. Just like the Egyptians and the world at that time had to come to Pharaoh and acknowledge him in order to obtain food, so too it will happen to God's people at the end of this earth's history. It happened back in Bible times, and prophecy has told us it will happen once again. Along with the mark of the beast, these videos will clearly show the difference between the mark of the beast and the seal of God. And I think with all the restrictions, laws and absurdities that we see taking place now, it will give you some idea of what that may look like. God is trying his best to prepare each one of us individually to trust and rely on him completely, and that can be a tough process. It requires absolute surrender on our part, and we need to pray that we remain willing, placing ourselves in the hands of the potter no matter the cost. Only through him are we going to be able to stand through these end times, as more draconian laws seem to be passed almost weekly. We must remember and look back on the times that God has provided for his faithful children and have faith and trust in his word. Whether it be manna falling from heaven, as it did for the Israelites, or ravens bringing bread, as for Elijah, we must have faith that God will provide for his children once again, as he has in the past.
He that walketh righteously, and speaketh uprightly, he that despiseth the gain of oppressions, that shaketh his hands from holding of bribes, that stoppeth his ears from hearing of blood, and shutteth his eyes from seeing evil, he shall dwell on high. His place of defence shall be the munitions of rocks. Bread shall be given him, his waters shall be sure. Thine eyes shall see the King in his beauty. They shall behold the land that is very far off. Although the fig tree shall not blossom, neither shall fruit be in the vines, the labour of the olive shall fail, and the fields shall yield no meat. The flock shall be cut off from the fold, and there shall be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation.
Keeping faith in God when all seems bleak around us is what we need to do. Just like Joseph, he kept looking to God in the good and the bad times, and we too also must have this steadfast faith and trust. Now let's look a little more closely at this issue of the famine in Egypt and what came about as a result of it, because it looks like we may be starting to see the same scenarios beginning in the world today, if the Lord does not hold things back any longer. Jesus said something about the famine in Matthew 24 verse 7, where he talked about some of the signs leading up to the end of this world's history. He said,
And ye shall hear of wars, and rumours of wars. See that ye be not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there shall be famines, and pestilences, and earthquakes in divers places.
First of all, Jesus speaks of war. We understand that war is man-made, the few at the top deciding they want more power and money. They cause all the conflict, then just sit back whilst war rages and thousands suffer and die. But they don't suffer at all, with the majority of them getting richer from the carnage and loss of life that does not affect them. The other things that are mentioned are famine, pestilences, and earthquakes, and these almost seem to be separate from war, because these last three we attribute to natural causes. However, whilst to a certain degree this may be correct, with today's technology all of these can, and I believe in some cases, be deliberately caused by mankind. Again, we have shown the evidence for this in some of our videos. But let's just jump to the end of the list, because earthquakes might be the most difficult one for us to wrap our mind around as being man-made. But there's an interesting website called Human-Induced Earthquake Database, where you can see a map of all the earthquakes that were not natural, but caused by human intervention. I don't know the exact time frame here, but these are earthquakes that have been humanly induced, and there are many causes for this.
Things like fracking, mining, water reservoir impoundment, conventional oil and gas. These are the top 4, and you can look into the others because the list goes on. The point is, we are certainly seeing a rise in earthquakes.
Now, it is true that there is something different between inducing something and directly being able to make it happen. And there seems to be evidence that the weather can be controlled and can actually cause earthquakes and other weather patterns. We won't get into all that here, but the point is, the increase we see in earthquakes are partly due to human activity. So, if that's the case, then could it also be true when we look at those other things in the list, like pestilences and famine? Do humans have a larger role to play in them than perhaps we have thought before? Encyclopedia Britannica says,
the most common human cause of famine is warfare. In addition to destroying crops and food supplies, warfare disrupts the distribution of food through the strategic use of siege and blockade tactics, and through the incidental destruction of transportation routes and vehicles.
Now this has been true through all history. You can look at the 2 times that Jerusalem was destroyed. The first time, there was a siege by the Babylonians in the Old Testament. The Bible tells us in 2 Kings 25 that there was a famine in the city, and the famine became so bad that the city finally fell to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. If we then jump forward to the New Testament, hundreds of years later, we see Rome's destruction of Jerusalem. The same thing happened. There was a siege which resulted in famine. And now, a couple of thousand years later in our day, it seems that's what is causing much of the famine today. There are wars going on, and there are powers that are blocking ports and so forth, and it's just the same dynamics, but on a bigger scale. On May 19th, 2022, The Economist said this:
The widely accepted idea of a cost of living crisis does not begin to capture the gravity of what may lie ahead. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary-General, warned on May 18th that the coming months threatened the spectre of a global food shortage that could last for years. The high cost of staple foods has already raised the number of people who cannot be sure of getting enough to eat by 440 million to 1.6 billion. Nearly 250 million are on the brink of famine. If, as is likely, the war drags on and supplies from Russia and Ukraine are limited, hundreds of millions more people could fall into poverty. Political unrest will spread, children will be stunted, and people will starve.
Encyclopedia Britannica goes on to talk about the deliberate destruction of crops and food supplies, and how this became a common tactic of war.
The deliberate destruction of crops and food supplies became a common tactic of war in the 19th century, employed by both attacking and defending armies. The scorched earth policy adopted by the Russians in 1812 not only deprived Napoleon's armies of needed food, but also starved the Russian people, who depended on the land.
Can you imagine a government that would sacrifice its own people for their own gain? Well, today it's not as hard to imagine as it may have been a few years ago. But let's now go back to Genesis and look at chapter 47.
And there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very sore, so that the land of Egypt and all the land of Canaan fainted by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, for the corn which they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. And when money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came unto Joseph, and said, Give us bread, for why should we die in thy presence? For the money faileth. And Joseph said, Give your cattle, and I will give you for your cattle, if money fail. And they brought their cattle unto Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for horses, and for the flocks, and for the cattle of the herds, and for the asses, and he fed them with bread for all their cattle for that year. When that year was ended, they came unto him the second year, and said unto him, We will not hide it from my lord, how that our money is spent. My lord also hath our herds of cattle. There is not aught left in the sight of my lord, but our bodies and our lands. Wherefore shall we die before thine eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be servants unto Pharaoh. And give us seed, that we may live and not die, that the land be not desolate. And Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for the Egyptians sold every man his field, because the famine prevailed over them. So the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he removed them to cities, from one end of the borders of Egypt even to the other end thereof. Then Joseph said unto the people, Behold, I have bought you this day, and your land, for Pharaoh.
That was a lot to read, but it is important, because we see that what happened to the people back then is beginning to happen again. Let's just walk our way through the Bible's description of this famine. And there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very sore, so that the land of Egypt and all the land of Canaan fainted by reason of the famine. Famine represents a time of scarcity. The people were desperate. There was a lack of basic necessities such as bread. This scarcity led to desperation and suffering. The famine serves as a powerful reminder of the fragility of life and how unprepared we are for such calamities. We see from these verses that when the famine struck, the people paid for their bread. But because of the cost and the fact that the famine continued, they had no more money left. It had all been spent just to live. The famine continued, and with no money, they again come to Joseph. And this time they paid with what goods they had, their horses, flocks and cattle, their livestock. Still, things did not improve, and once again they returned to Joseph. In desperation, they said, Buy us, our land, and we will be servants to Pharaoh. So now they give their homes and their land. They give their sons and their daughters and themselves in order to be able to buy food. And now they are totally dependent on Pharaoh. They are totally under his control and the control of his government. The next thing we see happening is that they are being moved into the cities. They are now under the total control of the government and are reliant on the government for everything. They have no money, no land of their own, and they are now living in cities where the government decided they should be. Today, in 2024, those who are awake as to what is going on in our world realize that we are facing a crisis. We don't know exactly how quickly it will get worse or to what extent it will go, but it certainly seems that events are moving rapidly. People are willing to give up a lot in order to have food, to get the next meal on the table. People also want security, and so certainly one thing that would lead the world to accept a one-world government and ultimately the mark of the beast would be a food crisis. This would certainly be a good way to gain control of people, as we saw with the famine in Egypt in the time of Joseph. In these 3 videos, we clearly show what is going on behind the scenes, and it is from the foundation of these things, which came to the forefront with the COVID-19 pandemic, that has opened the door even further to the dystopian things we see going on today. None of these things we see today are happening by chance. They are all planned, and the majority of people are now so brainwashed that they have no real idea of what is going on. But the aim is that we will own nothing and we will be happy, just like the Egyptians ended up owning nothing, bought out by the government in order to live. Today, the elites, who have not been voted in, are pushing for total control, a one-world government, of which we have spoken of for many years, the few controlling the masses, working towards a total reset of civilization, treating us like puppets dancing to their tune. And unfortunately, that is what is happening to the majority of people today. As Pharaoh moved everyone into the city, so that is the aim today. We see the plans for 15-minute cities springing up everywhere. A few are awake to the larger picture behind these things, but the majority are unaware of what is really going on, and so are being led blindly along. George Orwell once said,
"When you don't realize you are in a warfare, it's easy to be killed."
The World Economic Forum has been quietly working on these 15-minute cities. This plan, or should we say scheme, that has recently advanced from the planning stage to the prototype stage, should concern you if you value your individual liberty and freedom. We have stated in our videos that COVID was a testing ground to see how compliant people would be and how the populations would react. We saw during COVID that the majority were very compliant, locked in their homes 24/7, and being bombarded with fake news of thousands dying, and then, in desperation, crying out to the government for help. And like a knight in shining armour, they had the solution almost overnight with an untested vaccine that has now shown to be the cause of death and illness to possibly more people than death by COVID. This is called the Hegelian dialectic. Some of you may have heard of the Hegelian dialectic. It's a complex philosophy where the end justifies the means. If we simply try and break it down, it looks like this. Let's say we have governments that want to see major changes, such as centralization of power. They will either have to wait for a major calamity to take place, or they will have to create a major calamity or problem. When that major problem takes place, it will then be the government's responsibility to manage the reaction of the people. In most cases, the government will want the people to be in a state of fear, because then people are more easily managed. When the fear is at an all-time high, the governments can suggest a solution to the problem, and that solution will bring about a change in society that the governments wanted from the very beginning. So fear is the number one way of controlling the masses. They create a divide between us all, and then add in fear, and fear equals control. If you can scare people into believing something enough, then you can create a significant level of control, and this is what we see happening daily. Interesting points to dwell on, maybe. Now, we also said that the deception on the heels of COVID would be far worse than the virus itself, and that we needed to be calibrated to the times. These things have proved to be true. Since COVID, great deception and changes have taken place, and more are on the way, each one intensifying to ensure the long-awaited agenda is fulfilled.
Whilst some of these modern 15-minute cities that are up and coming look amazing in both design and engineering, the promotional material and the videos and all the other things they show is completely distorted, because they omit the fact that, yes, you can have an amazing life in these cities if you're in the top 1%, but if you're in the other 99% that the majority are, then it's a very different story.
Many have started to speak out and protest against these things. These people are classed as troublemakers and conspiracy theorists with the governments, who say that these cities are good for the people and, of course, the environment. Now, if this was just an isolated plan going ahead, then it may be a different matter. But with all the other things being imposed upon us by the unelected, then maybe it's not as Orwellian as it sounds. It is for you to decide what you believe and to look into these things for yourselves. We have become a lazy generation, a generation that is impatient, a generation that wants ease of life and everything at their fingertips. And so for many, these amazing-looking cities seem to embrace every need of the people and are being sold to a public who are ready to dance to the government's tune for convenience.
However, within these cities there will be constant surveillance, which will cost your personal freedoms. Very few cars, living, working, shopping under one roof. This is their plan. This is not make-believe or conspiracy theories, and yet the majority do not even know of the World Economic Forum, let alone their plans, because it is not in the newspapers or on public media platforms, and therefore they are unaware of what is really happening, despite these plans being published by those who are aiming for total control and compliant nations. Here is an example.
But of course, this is all for the good of the environment, as you will now not need a car, just a push bike. No need to use a bus or train, because you can either bike or walk to your furthest destination at 15 minutes. You can each do the research and logical thinking for yourself on these 15-minute cities and conclude if this is where you would like to live. Remember what the World Economic Forum's slogan is: you will own nothing and you will be happy. Sounds just what happened to the Egyptians. 15-minute cities, constant surveillance, cashless societies are just a few of the dystopian things we see and brought about. Of course, these are all for the good of climate change and saving planet Earth. As I have said, the majority have never heard of the World Economic Forum or Klaus Schwab and the world leaders who meet each year in Davos. However, they are certainly among those calling the shots. On October the 18th, 2019, a very interesting meeting took place. The World Economic Forum, the Johns Hopkins Center for Health and Security, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation hosted Event 201, which modelled a fictional coronavirus pandemic. We spoke about this meeting in our video, Darkness Before Dawn.
The scenario predicted that the pandemic would produce a worldwide recession. Just a month later, the first reported case of coronavirus was reported in China. The super-rich profited from this recession, while many middle and working-class stockholders lost their investments and savings, and many smaller businesses were destroyed, closed down. People were made homeless, while the rich just kept getting richer.
For those who think that this was just a coincidence, they really need to pull their head out of the sand and take a good look around them. Take a look at the changes that have taken place since the pandemic. Think of the economic and psychological damage it did. Think of what it's done to the workplace and culture in just the UK alone. Many small businesses went out of business, never again to recover. Much heartache, stress and damage was done at that time, and for many it still continues today. We see one draconian statement after another as to how we should live and what we should do coming forth from the World Economic Forum and the World Health Organization. Elites who have not been elected, but because of their great wealth and contacts, continue to dictate and reform our world, with 2030 being the year all of these things will have been implemented. People like Bill Gates and others like him made millions on the planned pandemic and the so-called vaccines that were produced.
Pfizer vaccine bonanza slows. Bill Gates sold early, made huge profits. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation bought 1,038,674 shares of BioNTech in September of 2019, just months before the pandemic was announced, at a pre-public offering price of $18.10 per share. Then the foundation sold 86% of its holdings over the third quarter of 2021 for $300 per share, pocketing a profit of approximately $260 million, or more than 15 times its original investment.
There are more articles like these that say the same. From what I have read, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has owned Pfizer stocks since 2002. The foundation also invests in vaccines. As to the super rich, the fortunes of the 10 richest men in the world more than doubled during the first 2 years of the pandemic. Their combined fortunes were worth $700 billion before the pandemic, but they totaled $1.5 trillion after.
The pandemic has made the world's wealthiest far richer, but has led to more people living in poverty, according to the charity Oxfam. Lower incomes for the world's poorest contributed to the death of 21,000 people each day, its report claims. But the world's 10 richest men have more than doubled their collective fortunes since March 2020, Oxfam said.
How? Because they knew it was coming. It was planned, as Event 201 predicted. As stated earlier, COVID was the foundation of much that we see happening now. A test to see how compliant the people would be, and another step toward total control. Since COVID, surveillance has increased beyond what we would ever have imagined just a few years ago. The idea of government agents spying on citizens may have been treated as conspiracy theories and laughed at in the past, but it's now an open secret for those prepared to face up to what's really happening. However, the gradual chipping away of our privacy protection is far from funny.
In this video, which you can watch online, the Kenyan President, William Ruto, speaks of a digital ID system that was to be launched last December 2023. Once again, it's interesting to see the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's involvement in Kenya's digital ID initiative, known as the MAA number. The foundation is advising the Kenyan government on developing and rolling out this program, which aims to address challenges such as citizen identification and authentication, primary registration document management, and improving social programs and government operations. The initiative has been met with skepticism and concerns over potential discrimination and privacy erosion. The program specifically targets newborn babies, proposing a shift from paper birth certificates to digital IDs that are somehow linked to the individual. This has raised concerns about the implications for surveillance and control of citizens. The video expresses a critical view of the initiative, suggesting that it could lead to a new generation of Kenyans who are completely monitored and controlled through this digital ID system.
I very much doubt that this will stop in Kenya. It is more than likely that this is a testing ground that governments will in time want done globally. The implanting of chips for all your data is already being tested.
Patrick Poorman from the Netherlands, a 37-year-old, doesn't need to use a bank card or his mobile phone to pay. Instead, he simply places his left hand near the contactless card reader, and the payment goes through. He adds that he is not concerned that his whereabouts could be tracked. The report went on to say that for many, the idea of having such a chip implanted in our body is an appalling one. But a 2021 survey of more than 4,000 people across the UK and the European Union found that 51% would consider it. However, without giving a percentage figure, the report added that invasiveness and security issues remained a major concern for respondents. How much are we willing to pay for the sake of convenience?
In a technological landscape where nearly everyone uses a smartphone, what would have been considered an Orwellian nightmare just a few decades ago is now closer to reality than anyone would have hoped. But just how bad is it?
At this moment, you might be under surveillance. Your internet activity could be tracked, your position located, your movements observed, your conversations intercepted, your banking activity analysed, and your emails scanned. That's just a fraction of what modern technology is capable of. Incredible advancements could destroy anonymity and privacy. Smartwatches check pulses, track sleeping time, locate phones, and log every step. Such tracking has become normal. GPS bracelets have been used to track prisoners. But many today take the risk of having their devices turned into such a bracelet without giving it a second thought. With each new phone, app or upgrade, you run the risk of becoming a greater target to surveillance. Your smartphone camera can be hacked and you and your surroundings observed without you realizing it. Your microphone can be used to spy on you. Outsiders can collect your online activity. You can see your location on Google Maps, and so can others. Some may be suspicious when giving their biometric data to a government agent, but then are less concerned when unlocking their phones with facial, vocal, or touch identification.
So what else have we seen come into the fore since COVID? Well, we have certainly seen a push for digital currency, CBDC, which is the switch from cash to digital money and provides banks and governments with control of your money and spending. If you think this is nonsense, then just look at what happened with these truck drivers when they would not comply with the government's draconian demands during COVID and the increase in restrictions on access to their money. Since then, we have seen many individuals and companies regularly being debanked and losing access to their money. You see, once you have no cash, you are totally dependent on the banks and governments. You will have to comply or not be able to pay your bills and buy your food. We are also seeing increasing Christian nationalism in Western democracies, especially the United States. This encompasses Project 2025, which we believe, if successful, would help to bring in the Coming Sunday law and ultimately the Mark of the Beast, which we have spoken of in many of our videos.
For those of you who have not heard of Christian nationalism, or maybe don't know what it is, Christian nationalism is a belief system that seeks to establish a close connection between Christianity and a nation's identity. Advocates of Christian nationalism consider their view of Christianity integral to their country's character, often desiring government promotion or enforcement of the religion's position within society. Essentially, it asserts that the United States, or any other nation, was founded by God to be a Christian nation, and its mission is divinely directed by a higher power. This ideology can intersect with political and social issues, impacting legislation, cultural norms, and attitudes towards minority groups.
So although this may well sound like the answer to all this wokeism and lawlessness that we find ourselves living in right now, this group, who do not keep God's biblical commandments, but choose to worship on the day of the sun, as instituted by the Catholic Church, could well end up being the persecuting power to those who keep God's holy day, according to Revelation 13 in the Bible. As I have just stated, Christian nationalism is also linked to Project 2025. For those of you who have not heard of Project 2025, here is a quick overview.
Project 2025 is a far-right extremist agenda that poses a threat to a multiracial, diverse democracy. Led by the far-right Heritage Foundation and supported by over 80 organizations, it aims to put Christianity at the center of American government and society. The project seeks to turn what they see as a biblical worldview into federal law, often employing Christian nationalist talking points.
We are also seeing the campaign from the World Economic Forum to switch from animal food sources, mainly meat, to plant-based alternatives and insects. We see wars in Ukraine, Russia and Palestine, with fears of Western countries becoming involved. Increase in protest, often erupting in violence. There is unrest and crime increasing everywhere, and trust in the police is at an all-time low. We are seeing massive increases in illegal immigration into so-called Western European democracies and the United States, while citizens of those countries are becoming homeless and in great need. And yet, with all this need and poverty, knowledge is on the increase.
In his book, Critical Path, Buckminster Fuller noticed that until 1900, human knowledge doubled approximately every century, and by the end of World War II, knowledge was doubling every 25 years. Some years later, a report published by IBM anecdotally added to Fuller's theory, and predicted by 2020 knowledge would double every 12 hours, fueled by the Internet. Different types of knowledge have different rates of growth, but it is generally acknowledged that human knowledge is increasing at an extraordinary rate. Arguably, we may have reached a point where relevant knowledge is increasing faster and in greater quantities than we can absorb.
Welcome to Artificial Intelligence, AI, which we are seeing a big rising. If you are not fearful of this, then you certainly should be, because this is and will cause massive job losses, which will only escalate as time goes on, and will bring in a world where you will not know the fake from the real. The problem is, we live in an age like never before in history when it comes to instant gratification. I want what I want, and I want it now. Don't make me wait. And as technology has exploded, the increase in the speed of transportation and communication, the production of fast foods, we have become lazy and impatient, wanting things at the touch of a button, and not thinking of the implication of these things. We have become a generation that cannot do without their phone and all the other gadgets that we are surrounded with, willing, it seems, to give up our freedom for instant gratification. Transgenderism and woke ideology have increased massively and has now reached an absurd stage, punishing those who don't agree with these things and presenting them as villains and homophobes. How hypocritical this is, because those who do not agree with this woke ideology are told that they have to be inclusive, diverse and tolerant. However, surely this is very one-sided, because those claiming that's what we ought to be are then not being inclusive, diverse and tolerant when someone holds a different view than theirs and does not agree with all of this nonsense. The list goes on, and still so many are unaware of what is really happening. The normal that we all knew and took for granted not so long ago has gone forever, and a harsh and freedomless future awaits us unless we wake up and oppose these things. Another move by the World Economic Forum is our food and what we eat and what we can grow.
The World Economic Forum's future of food is to eliminate meat consumption and promote alternative proteins and lab-grown meat, aiming to reduce meat production and encourage plant-based diets. You only have to look in any supermarket now to see the vast range of plant-based products within the last 2 to 3 years. This is why we are seeing the decline in the number of farms in the EU and the shift towards large-scale specialized farming. And although they will tell you this push for alternative proteins is for environmental or health concerns, it is actually driven by business interests and control. All of this will and is impacting on traditional farming practices and our individual freedom of choice.
They are coming after the land and the cattle. Farmers are being forced into selling their land and offered grants to kill off their livestock, all because of so-called climate change and the emissions from these farms, which have been around for hundreds of years but are now being blamed for a large part of CO2 emissions, whilst those who are enforcing these weird and wonderful rules of climate change fly to their climate control meetings in their private jets. Genetic modification allows just one individual gene, or a small number of genes, to be inserted into a plant or animal. This enables them to be used in new and very precise ways. Foods that have been changed in an unnatural way are not good for our health. These bioengineered food products can introduce things into our bodies that we know nothing about, and again, the majority are not even aware of what they will be eating.
David Attenborough might have urged world leaders at Davos to take urgent action on climate change, but it appears no one was listening. As he spoke, experts predicted up to 1,500 individual private jets will fly to and from airfields serving the Swiss ski resort this week.
Even our great advocate for a greener planet, King Charles, does not practice what he preaches. Like all the elites, it's do as we say, not as we do. And still the majority of people are unaware of how bad things are getting and the reasons behind it all, which has been in the making for many years. But now the design has become the prototype, with the conclusive result of all their scheming to be implemented by the year of 2030.
It seems ironic that at a time when farmers are being forced off their land, Bill Gates, the fourth richest person in the world and a self-described nerd who is known for his early programming skills rather than his love of the outdoors, has been quietly snatching up 242,000 acres of farmland across the United States, enough to make him the top private farmland owner in America. The Land Report revealed that Gates, who has a net worth of nearly $121 billion, according to Forbes, has built up a massive farmland portfolio spanning 18 states.
Interesting. Sounds a bit like the same scenario as the shares in Pfizer he bought up just before the pandemic struck and ended selling just in time to add to his billions. Now, as farmers are being forced off their land, Mr. Gates becomes the top private farm owner in America. But whilst Mr. Gates buys up farmland, farmers worldwide are struggling. The climate change agenda, net zero, and the push to switch away from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources is causing a massive increase in energy cost, which in turn causes massive food price inflation and impacts global farming due to these massive increases in farming costs.
Recently there was a significant standoff in Paris, where 15,000 police and armoured vehicles had been deployed to block farmers protesting against these government policies. The government has labelled the farmers as right-wing extremists and even terrorists. However, this situation is not isolated to France. Similar protests have spread to other EU countries like Germany, Italy and the Netherlands, all sparked by discontent with agricultural policies and the push for net zero carbon emissions, along with the culling of healthy, productive livestock.
And in the UK, something you may not have heard of is that if you own a chicken, just one chicken in your backyard, that one chicken has to be registered with the government. And apparently, the punishment for not registering your chicken is up to 6 months in prison or a fine of £5,000. This registration is again effective surveillance, because they want to know where your chicken is at all times. Bird keepers will need to provide information, including their contact details, their exact location, where their chicken or bird is kept, and the details about it. They will also have to have justification for keeping the bird. This comes into effect in the UK on the 1st of October 2024. Will this be the next thing to have to register and justify your reason for wanting to grow your own produce? Maybe. We will see. As we have said, those in control have not been voted in, and many of the world's leaders support the World Economic Forum, with some having been trained and prepped by them. These globalist aims are to the point of madness and extremely dangerous to all nations, especially those in the West, even more so since their marriage with the United Nations in 2019.
A global corporate and government marriage took place last week, and governments and citizens were not even invited as guests. The occasion was the signing of a Memorandum of Understanding between the corporate-led World Economic Forum and the United Nations. The nuptial agreement commits the two institutions to unprecedented levels of cooperation and coordination in the fields of education, women, financing, climate change, and health. The big question the memorandum doesn't answer is who authorized this decision to turn the UN into a multi-stakeholder body? Why is a business body being given privileged access to a global institution that should be only answerable to nation states? Who does the WEF represent beyond its billionaire stakeholders? This agreement not only elevates multi-stakeholderism as the solution to the problems with the current multilateral system, it did not even seek approval or intergovernmental oversight by the UN's own member states.
The New World Order, One World Government, have been working towards total control for many years now, and with the UN signing the deal in Davos with the World Economic Forum, this further threatens democratic principles. The global problems that are created are designed to profit the leaders of the New World Order and use the appropriate global organizations to determine agreements on how to fix the problems. Just like COVID-19, that created a sense of urgency, fear and stress, which was fueled by the biased reporting of the mainstream media, who are also under their control. We have spoken about these things for many years. These are just two of the many powerful global organizations used and manipulated by the real leaders of globalism. All these draconian things that are overtaking society have been long planned. The elites of the New World Order have control over all major aspects of society: banks, media, the World Health Organization, and these, like many other bodies, have not been voted in, but they are out to gain total control of our lives. But again, the majority are unaware of this. In 1944, the World Bank was formed, and it now works in 189 countries. The United Nations was formed in 1945, and in 1948 the World Health Organization was established as a specialized agency of the United Nations. In recent years since the pandemic, and probably even before, the World Health Organization has been pushing to basically take over the planning and managing of pandemics from national elected governments of the 196 recognized countries of the world. Now, advice is one thing, takeover is completely different. We had lots of advice from the World Health Organization during the pandemic about what we should and should not do, and of course most of it in terms of supporting lockdowns and vaccines. Last year, 2023, the World Health Organization was stopped by India because if just one of the 196 countries do not agree to this pandemic treaty, then it cannot go through. They tried again this year. Thankfully, however, the meeting did not go as planned. However, if it does get through at some point, it would mean that if the World Health Organization called a pandemic and decided they wanted to close the airports to all 196 countries, and that all of the 196 countries had to wear masks and mandated all of these countries to be vaccinated, then it would have to be carried out. There would be no choice whether or not you wanted to comply. It would be mandatory or face the penalty. Any organisation that has any power to control our lives in any way should always be accountable to us, the people. But of course, this would not be the case. The World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, and many governments, including our own, are not for the people but for themselves, for more wealth and total control. We need to fight for our freedoms or we will lose them completely and bear the consequences, not only for us, but for our children and grandchildren. Why is it that many governments do not seem to want their individual voters to have a say over what they do anymore? Well, because, as we have said, many of these governments are the puppets of the master. We once lived as a democratic country, but sadly no more. What we have spoken of for many years we now see coming to fruition. The fear of COVID and of climate change were deliberately created to keep you fearful about the future, whilst the powers that be happily pursue their own insidious agenda without fear of being held accountable to the people. And we have been kept in fear from war and unrest all around us, the hike in cost of living, homelessness, poverty, and bear in mind all this is taking place by bodies of people who want total control. Bodies of people who have not been voted in by the people, but have the majority of governments dancing to their tune. Their plan is that by 2030, nobody will own anything except the elites. They say that solidarity makes everyone equal, except the elites. They say you will rent everything and stay indebted to someone, the elites. And they say you will be happy, or you will face the consequences. We have looked at many of these issues in our other videos. We have spoken how we believe climate change would be one of the key factors in bringing about the Sunday Law, which the papacy has been pushing for many years, and we see this gaining momentum now at a rapid pace. COVID also brought in the push for a cashless society, which again we have been saying in our videos would come about, and since COVID, this has been implemented before our eyes. Just look at many of our petrol stations now that have no kiosk to pay at. You can only pay by card. Many of the car parks have been changed to card-only machines, and many of the self-service checkouts in the UK are now card-only transactions, with many ATM machines and banks disappearing. Whilst this may seem convenient, have you thought of the implications and restrictions that this will bring along with it? Have you thought of what a wholly cashless society will mean?
There can be no more earning pocket money for helping out. No more cash slipped into the hands of a child from their grandparent when visiting. No more money in birthday cards. No more piggy banks for your child to save pocket money and to learn about the value of money. No more charity collections. No more selling bits and pieces from your home that you no longer want or need for a little cash in return. And on top of this, how will homeless people get by without their small, daily cash collections?
However, what a cashless society does guarantee.
Banks and governments will have full control of every single penny you own. Every transaction you make will be recorded. All your movements and actions will be traceable. Access to your own money can be denied. At the click of a button, your account can be locked.
We have also seen the push for what you will eat. Look in your grocery store and see the amount of plant-based foods that have appeared. Why? Because they have decided what you will eat. Meat will soon become a luxury rather than the diet of most people. Instead, they think insects are better for us, and when you think it might be healthy to eat plant food, you may want to take a look at the so-called healthy ingredients, and this is just one of the plant-based products. Most of the time, we don't know what we are eating or what they have added. There is so much more we could look at. We have just skimmed the surface, but you can do your own research at the points we have covered. So let's just do a quick summary of the similarities of the famine in Joseph's day and what is soon to come upon our world. Because the Bible tells us there is nothing new under the sun. The people came with money to buy food, but as the famine continued and their money was gone, they then have to give their cattle, their assets, in order to eat. But the famine continues and they come again, and this time all that is left is their land, their homes, themselves, their sons and daughters, and this they also relinquish in order to survive. Then many are moved into the cities. Pharaoh is now in total control. He owns everything, and the people become totally reliant on the one-world government of that day. Another interesting parallel to note is verse 22 of Genesis 47.
The only land he did not buy was the land belonging to the priests. They received an allotment of food directly from Pharaoh, so they didn't need to sell their land.
In these verses, we see that not everybody had to sell their land and their property. Those exempt were the priests. The priests did not have to sell their land, and they were given an allotment of food directly from Pharaoh. Pharaoh was in alliance with the priest, the church, and when you dive into history you can see why. The priests were actually the most powerful class within Egypt, in some ways more powerful than the Pharaoh themselves, so the pharaohs did not willingly cross them. The priests were extremely powerful, and so when everyone else has sold their land and all they had, they end up as the most powerful class in society. This is the exact same parallels that we see in Revelation. In Genesis 47 verse 23, we see just a little more of what goes on at this time.
Then Joseph said to the people, "Look, today I have bought you and your land for Pharaoh. I will provide you with seed, so you can plant the fields."
So not all the people had to move off their land. However, they are no longer the owners. They are just working the land, and in verse 24 we are told that they have to pay tax on it.
Then, when you harvest it, 1/5 of your crop will belong to Pharaoh. You may keep the remaining 4/5 as seed for your fields, and as food for you, your households, and your little ones. "You have saved our lives," they exclaimed. "May it please you, my lord, to let us be Pharaoh's servants."
So why were the Egyptians happy to give up all their possessions to Pharaoh and have to pay tax on the land they once owned? It was because of the crisis, only a crisis severe enough that if they did not do it, they and their loved ones would die. Are we looking at a crisis developing in our world today that will bring the entire world to the place where the Egyptians were, under the total control of the powers that be? We believe that's what the world is leaning toward. Once again, how quickly we get there remains to be seen. The laws and absurdities that we have seen come into play in the last few years do not all come at the same time, but step by step in their progression. It's just like the frog in boiling water scenario, which states that if a frog is suddenly put into boiling water, it will jump out. But if the frog is put in tepid water, which is then brought to the boil slowly, it will not perceive the danger and will be cooked to death. Many people have become like this frog, unaware of the dangers. They have become lukewarm and have just accepted the slow progression of fascism that is slowly coming to the boil. As we have shown in our videos, Bible prophecy once again is fulfilling right before our eyes. And as in Egypt in the days of Joseph, so today we have an alliance of church and state coming together, which the Bible tells us should remain separate. With this famine, everything changed for the Egyptians. The normal they had known was gone forever. So too for us. After COVID-19, everything changed, and what we looked upon as normal has gone. There are many similarities in what happened to the Egyptians happening today, or coming down the pipeline in the very near future. We have seen the short video of what the World Economic Forum told us a few years ago of what they had planned for us, and these things have indeed been or are well in the process of being implemented. We are now going to show you some slides. You can pause and read all the contents, or go to the websites and read or watch these things for yourselves. What we are going to look at is not make-believe or conspiracy theories. These things are from the European Union and reputable news sources, so you are able and should check these things out for yourselves. As I looked at all these things, it reminded me of the scenario that took place just before COVID-19 broke out. The meeting was called Event 201, which took place October the 18th, 2019. We briefly looked at this earlier. However, it was a good job that this meeting did take place, because just 2 months later, on December the 19th, the first reported case of coronavirus was reported in Wuhan, China, and now the results of that are history, and we see that the scenario of Event 201 was spot on. The European Union is governed by unelected bureaucrats, meaning a body of non-elected officials, as is the World Economic Forum and the World Health Organization. But have you heard of the saying, money talks? Well, this seems to be the case with these elites, who are not voted in, but what they say transpires. And we have to become aware of what is going on around us. We have become complacent, and we need to wake up and push back. Otherwise, it will be too late. George Santayana once said this:
"Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it."
We are living at the end of Earth's history, and the Word of God tells us that there will be troublous times ahead, things happening that we would never have foreseen or dreamed of a few short years ago. The prophet Ezekiel saw the world's end coming, not with peace, but with much trouble.
"Son of man, this is what the sovereign Lord says to Israel. The end is here. Wherever you look, east, west, north or south, your land is finished. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Disaster after disaster is coming your way. The end has come. It has finally arrived. Your final doom is waiting."
Throughout the Bible, considerable instructions and many prophecies have been given, that we may know what is to take place. There are many signs that we see today. Therefore, nobody should be in ignorance. Only the sure word of prophecy can tell us how our world will come to its end. It will not come according to the suppositions of the elites or scientists, but according to the word of God.
And by the same word, the present heavens and earth have been stored up for fire. They are being kept for the day of judgment, when ungodly people will be destroyed. But the day of the Lord will come as unexpectedly as a thief. Then the heavens will pass away with a terrible noise, and the very elements themselves will disappear in fire, and the earth and everything on it will be found to deserve judgment. Nevertheless, we, according to his promise, look for new heavens and a new earth, wherein dwelleth righteousness.
This very planet, after being purified and freed from sin and all evil, will be the earth made new. Whether we are prepared or unprepared, the end of the world will come. The signs are all around us for those who are willing to look and study. If it wasn't for God's word and his promises, it could all get very discouraging. But the Bible tells us that eventually all of this evil will come crushing down, and sin and suffering will be no more. We must be the watchman on the wall, warning those in darkness to wake up before it is too late. Jesus, speaking of the end times and the time of trouble, said, "All these things must come to pass before he comes." The troublous times, the times of fear, will come, and we will only be able to stand firm and look up if we remain in him. When we started our ministry over 14 years ago and spoke of these things, we did not know exactly how and what would usher in the time of trouble such as never was. But we are now seeing these things taking place, and people fearing for all they see happening around them. We urge you to open your eyes to these things, and more importantly, to open your eyes to the Lord. Place your trust in Him, because He alone can save you. Times ahead will be hard and painful for many. Decisions to stand for what is right according to God's word will not be easy, but the rewards will be eternal. Not the temporary rewards of this world that will perish, but eternal life and peace that Jesus offers us for free.
History merely repeats itself. It has all been done before. Nothing under the sun is truly new.
With all the draconian things coming into place, it sometimes feels that we are living in a twilight zone, living between reality and fantasy. I don't really recognise this country anymore, or the world for that matter, because in the last few years it seems that insanity has been at an all-time high, with evil being called good and good being called evil. However, it is the devil that is behind all of this evil and insanity we see. He has been out to deceive mankind since the beginning, and that has been his tactic ever since, and more so now that his time is short. We must not be deceived or go along with the wickedness of men out for their own gains, but look to Jesus and ask for His guidance and His protection.
Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also.
We must be aware of the signs around us. We must keep watch and pray for strength and guidance. We live in a world where the majority have no desire to follow God. So, as part of the minority, will we put our faith in Jesus? Will we stand for that which is right in the troublous times ahead? Will we be awake and ready when Jesus comes? For Joseph, when those whom he trusted sold him into slavery, his life that he had known changed forever, never to go back to the normal life he had lived and loved. But Joseph survived and came through all his trials and devastation, because he remained faithful in his trust and love for God. In the days that we find ourselves in, and those which lie ahead, we too will survive if we stand firm for that which is right. We must put all our faith and trust in Jesus. Then we, like Joseph, will come through victorious and be ready for Jesus when he comes to take us home.
You will keep in perfect peace all who trust in you, all whose thoughts are fixed on you. Trust in the Lord always, for the Lord God is the eternal rock.